Uh, it gives me pleasure to welcome all of you to this event. I thank you for patiently waiting for the start. So as not to take much time, I will just quickly run through the introductions of those who are there on the dais. You have, of course, Mr. Amitabh Kant, who is presently the Secretary DIPP. As someone aptly described him, someone being Maya Menchandani just about 10 minutes ago. He's the Mr. Make in India, as it were. So I don't need to go any further than that. Then, of course, we have Ashley Tellis. Ashley Tellis is one of those who has successfully straddled both scholarship and policy making, and is the envy of most scholars in India who are still trying to get policymakers to take notice of them. But however, he is, of course, joined by his co-author, Dr. Raja Mohan, who here, of course, requires no introduction, being one of the foremost Indian strategic thinkers. And of course, they are going to be moderated. Their discussion is going to be moderated by Maya Mirchandani, one of our better-known news anchors, journalists. Briefly, this book is a joint venture between Ashley Tellis and Raja Mohan, and it gives you a detailed understanding of the strategic rationale for deeper US-Indian economic ties. I'm going to take the shortcut and quickly summarize their executive summary in a shorter version than what they have. So basically, what they're trying to convey to us is that the US has an interest in maintaining its hegemony in the world, that India could play an important role in this. For that, India needs to be stronger and more important on the world scene. And this is where US has to commit itself and help India actually develop economically as well as acquire a more greater prominence on the international scene. I will not take any further time of yours, and I will ask Amitabh to make his address. But before that, so that we save time at the end, I'll hand over a small gift.
Oh, this is a gift, you don't to deliver the keynote address at this very important occasion. I'm indeed delighted at this opportunity to interact with this very august gathering. Thank you for the invitation to join the conversation on US-India relationship. Let me first congratulate Dr. C. Rajamohan, who's been a very old friend of mine from my university days, and Dr. Ashley Tellis, whose writings I have greatly admired, and convey my deep appreciation for an outstanding publication they've brought out on Indo-US economic ties. I'm sure all of us will deliberate on the content of the publication of the esteemed scholars, and the suggestions here will help us to enhance bilateral relations between the two countries. I am in agreement with the authors that the transition to integrating India into the West cannot be rooted only in a political and security partnership between New Delhi and Washington. It has to be founded in a strong economic partnership between India and United States. I'm, however, a firm believer that this economic relationship between India and United States can only be strengthened if India grows rapidly at rapid rates of 9 to 10% per annum year after year for 3 decades or more, so that it becomes a strong economic powerhouse. And unless that doesn't happen, this relationship can never acquire strong foundation. So India must actually rapidly grow. And for doing that, India must take several measures. And to my mind, if we look at the Indo-US relationship, the total investments if you were to look at figures of the last 15 years, the total investment by America into India is just about 14.5 billion. And actually, in reality, the Indian companies have almost their investment is a little more than what Americans have invested into India. Our total trade, bilateral trade, is about 100, close to about, last year was about US dollar 100 billion during the last financial year. But my belief is that India needs to take several measures. And first and foremost, I must say that India over the last several decades has made itself a very, very complex, very complicated, and a very, very difficult place to do business. And therefore, India needs to take several measures to do away with a number of processes, procedures, rules, regulation, acts, which have made India very difficult to do business in. India must become an extremely simple, a very, very easy place to do business. And unless there is predictability, there's consistency, and there's clarity of policies, particularly in our taxation, it'll be very difficult to continue to get investments over a long period of time. That's number one. So anybody else, Americans will just not be able to comprehend. So we need to just make things simpler and easier. That's number one. Number two, my belief is that India can grow rapidly if India becomes a very integral part of the global supply chain. The way the world has grown is unless and until you're not a part of an integral part of a global supply chain and you don't have backward-forward linkages, it'll be very difficult to India to sustain its growth over a long period of time. And therefore, India must become a more and more and more and more open economy. And actually, if you were to look at last 9-10 months, India has rapidly tried to do that. If you were to look at the defense sector, for instance, it's taken out almost 60% of its items away from the licensing mechanism, de-licensed them. It has opened up the defense sector for manufacturing up to 49%. It can go up to 100% in cases of modernization and state-of-the-art. It has opened up its railway sector for FDI. It has opened up its construction, its medical devices, its insurance sector, its pension funds. So a vast range of sectors have been opened up. Actually, in reality, after the Make in India launch, since then, FDI into India has grown by about a whopping 48%. At a time when the FDI inflows across the world have slowed down by about 16%. So India must continue this process with greater vigor, with greater energy, with greater dynamism to open its economy more and more and more and more. That's number 2 point I want to make. Number 3 is that we must realize that there's a very young India. This is an India which is seeing a lot of young startups. There's a huge amount of energy. And this is actually reflecting in several things in terms of the number of startups we are seeing in this country, in terms of the huge amount of frugal engineering that we are seeing. And India is actually seeing a unique combination of technology, good engineering, and innovation. And if you were to look at it, the General Electric for GE, for instance, has done its electrocardiograph in India for, it manufactures its ECG machine for $1,500, which means you can get an ECG done. Patients in India can get an ECG done for just $1 as compared to the same machine being made in the United States for $10,000. If you were to look at the automobile sector, what Renault in its history of 118 years has done is to create for the first time in its history of 118 years a global car called the Quid, completely innovated and designed in India in its Chennai factory. So what India, including what we have done in Mars orbiter, putting the spaceship into Mars at 73 million, what it demonstrates is this unique strength of India of bringing in outstanding technology and doing it at a high technology, low cost, frugal engineering in India. And I'm increasingly seeing this in the defense manufacturing sector, where several youngsters and several auto component manufacturers actually started doing manufacturing for Boeing and Airbus. And I think that's a huge, huge opportunity for India. So we need to push this envelope forward because I think American companies will have to relocate their manufacturing bases. You'll see this as more and more of this happens. Fourthly, I think one big trend that's happening in India, which has not yet been discerned largely, is the fact that over the last 4 to 5 years, many multinational corporations of America and Europe have relocated their research and development out of their head offices in US and Europe and actually shifted them to Hyderabad and Bangalore. And over the last 4 to 5 years, over 1,000 companies have started doing R&D in India. They've created close to about 500,000 jobs. This is a unique trend of R&D shifting and relocating to India. My personal belief is that the world will see a huge emergence of trading blocks across the transatlantic, trans-Pacific, what's happening today, RCEP, so on. And India can't isolate itself from the world. It must gradually, rapidly, on a win-win basis, integrate itself with these trading blocks. If we are not able to do this, India will lose out. Its manufacturers will lose out. Its ability to produce for the global economy will lose out. So India must, with confidence, with determination, negotiate, penetrate these trading blocks on its own conditions. And I think we need to aggressively pursue this. This is my belief. And if this happens, India will strengthen itself with America, its economic ties. My belief is that there are several issues with United States of America on several fronts. When President Obama came down, the discussions were extremely good. There were very, very, very interesting discussions, and in the CEO discussions, and we yesterday had another long chat with all the Indian CEOs who are going to participate in the commercial and security dialogue, and the CEO forum, which will follow on October 21st, 22nd in the United States. And right after that, Prime Minister Modi will be there on 23rd, 24th in New York, and subsequently in California, in San Francisco. So my belief is that there are several issues on the American side as well. The issues of visa, the issues of totalization, the security, the social security which is cut, issues of market access for our pharma companies, for our mangoes and so on. But I think there's one issue which Americans always raise, and that is that issue of intellectual property rights. We must be very clear that India can never be a great manufacturing nation. It can never be a modern, progressive nation unless it doesn't learn to respect people's intellectual property. Whether we like it or not, India must believe in intellectual property rights. And to my mind, Indian companies have done exceedingly well. We must understand that we are totally TRIPS compliant. We have a provision of 3D under our act, which is totally TRIPS compliant. So when we've never had an issue with United Technologies, we've never had an issue with Boeing, we've never had an issue with major American companies. It's one or two pharma companies we've raised this issue. And we need to tell the Americans very clearly that there's no political democracy across the world which can survive without providing medicine at the right price points to its citizens. But we are pursuing a very aggressive policy on IPR. We've put a high-level task force which has drafted out a new IPR policy, and in about 2 months' time, we'll come out with one of the best IPR policies from across the world. And therefore, we need to tell the world that we are extremely confident about the intellectual property regime. So my belief is that in the long run, India must grow rapidly. You can't be a major power, you can't have good economic relations, you can't have strategic relations with America if you continue to grow at 4.5 to 5%. India must have the ambition to grow at 9 to 10% per annum. India is the last giant economy in the world which has started to grow. India is presently an oasis of growth in the midst of a very barren economic landscape across. We are growing at 7.5%. We need to accelerate that. And we need to accelerate this vigorously and with great energy. And I think if we continue to grow at 9 to 10% per annum for 3 decades, and if we create jobs, economic ties with America will get strengthened. If we don't, these ties will never get strengthened. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. I think that was a very insightful and candid presentation. Before I hand over to Maya, I have a task to perform, which is the ORF task. If I may ask those at the dais, stand up and hold this for a photo op. There. That is ours. It's not a video camera, otherwise we would have clapped. Oops. The strategic rationale is knocking out technology.
Sorry, this was my wake-up alarm.
Well, I'm glad you're awake. Okay. Thank you very much. And with this, I hand over proceedings to Maya.
Thank you, Nandan. Mr. Kant, really quite interesting, some of the details that you've talked about in terms of the candor and talking about how India does need to change a lot of things if economic relations are to improve. But I want to actually open by just asking both Dr. Rajamohan and Dr. Tellis to make a few introductory remarks about what they have written in the monograph. I've read it, but I think for the sake of the rest of the audience, Ashley, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Maya. Let me start by just briefly thanking ORF for hosting this event. It's wonderful to be participating here in the event this afternoon, particularly because of my own strong connections with ORF over the years. I also want to thank Mr. Kant for a quite remarkable set of comments today, which I hope will actually receive a wide audience in the United States. Particularly the conviction with which you argued the case for India joining the global regime without anything to fear. That's certainly good news for the United States and certainly welcome. I'll just take a few minutes to talk about the broad themes in my paper. This is a report that looks at the strategic rationale for deeper US-Indian economic ties. Obviously, there are many dimensions to the question of US-Indian economic ties that go beyond the strategic. Obviously, the economic reasons for deeper ties is the increased wealth and welfare of both our societies. But Raja and I focus this particular paper on the strategic dimensions. And I provide one US perspective. It's not a universal US perspective. In fact, there will be many Americans who will have different views from the ones that I express here. And Raja has offered an Indian perspective. So I'll just very briefly summarize my point. The key point I make is that the task that the United States faces in the coming century is the task of protecting its own position in the international system. And that is the task of preserving its primacy. And a very important way in which that primacy can be preserved will be through a very strong partnership with friends in the Asian continent. And a very important friend of the United States will be India. Not only because we share common democratic values and we have strong links between our societies, I take that for granted. But what will be fundamentally important to the United States is the fact that India's capacity to grow in power provides a balance in the Asia-Pacific that is very important for American interests. So when the United States argues that a strong India is in American interests, it's not meant to be a slogan. It is meant to be literally true. A strong India, an India that is capable of protecting itself, preserving the success of the democratic experiment, and projecting its power as it has done responsibly over the last several decades, to my mind, provides one of the critical pillars for balancing the rise of China. And to the degree that a capable India can protect itself and preserve a stable Asian political system, that also redounds to the benefits of the United States. So from a US point of view, the idea of a strong India cannot be optional. If you really care about American power, you have to wish for a strong India. And the paper goes on to state that the reasons why this objective is fundamentally in American interests is not simply for aspirational geopolitical reasons, but because the US and Indian economies actually share vital complementarities. And I was really delighted to hear what Amitabh said, precisely because of that point. because India has the capacity to bring extremely high quality, relatively low cost labor, India's contribution to raising the competitiveness of American firms in the global market is actually fundamental for America's own economic success. And so, in the report, I argue that the goal of the United States and India at the economic level must really be to create a symbiosis between our two economic systems so that American capital, American technology can be married with Indian labor, Indian capital, and India's unique frugal engineering, as you put it, to essentially push the economic and technological possibility frontiers further than they are. And so the short argument that I make is that the way to do that is by expanding trade. And trade in recent times is really the unique mechanism for amplifying growth, which would normally occur through the expansion of domestic demand. So to the degree that India successfully continues its own domestic liberalization at home, complements that liberalization through enhanced trade links with the United States, the stage is set for faster Indian growth. Faster Indian growth translates, in my mind, to greater Indian power. Greater Indian power serves the geopolitical objectives of a balance of power in Asia. And to the degree that there is a stable balance of power in Asia, American grand strategic objectives of preserving its own global primacy are preserved. So there is a unique complementarity between the economic strategy of deepening US Indian economic ties and the American grand strategy of protecting its own position in the international system. And that is the sum and substance of what my chapter argues.
Thank you. I think Ashley has said quite a bit. I mean, let me just take three sets of points, I mean, in terms of the Indian perspective that is put here. One, I think, is quite clearly that this book is not about economics. I mean, it's really about what are the political considerations or strategic considerations that must weigh upon Washington and Delhi to transform their economic relationship. Because it fundamentally assumes that, look, relationships between large countries, strategic partnerships, which, as Deng Xiaoping would say, probably you have to walk on two legs. I mean, that it has to have both an economic component as well as a political component. We've seen historically, I think the US has had strong economic relationships, strong military relations, a large number of countries. For example, Pakistan and Egypt have been two very consistent receivers of American military aid. But there was very little economic relationship, which in a sense actually leaves that relationships pretty cold and limited and one-dimensional. But what we saw with where the primacy of the economic thing between the Americans and the Chinese since 79 through the 80s actually saw the dramatic transformation that the China's integration into the global economy took place with the support of the Americans, which in part was driven by the political need to balance the Soviet Union. That the two factors came together to make China what it is today. And today the level of interdependence is so much between the two countries that, as I said, I mean, it's pretty difficult to disentangle that relationship today. As somebody said about, and in the India-US relationship, I think in a sense is partly weakened by the lack of the economic heft. So many of our Chinese friends keep asking us what's going on between India and the US. I said, look, the total trade between India and the US is not even equal to the deficit of trade between what the deficit that the US has with China in terms of trade. So the scale, in fact, Obama himself, when he came to Delhi, said, look, US and China do $500 billion of trade a year. India and the US are doing $100 billion. So how much those who talk about India containing China, India joining the Americans to abandon its strategic autonomy, look, what we're seeing is that one of the history's greatest economic integration that has taken place between US and China. And I think that level of interdependence, I mean, is something that today limits the conflict probably, but also tells you what actually economic partnership do in terms of changing China's position in the international system. So it's often been said about US and China is an unhappy relationship, but they can't find a way to get a divorce because of the economic interdependence. India and the US are great lovers. I mean, there's a lot of romance, but they can't get married. So there we are, the two sides limited by something or the other. So I think the challenge for us, as Ashley and I, we thought about it, that look, that you need to think about this economic relationship, and it's not just about, the grand strategic, and mostly the too many strategic types and too few economic types in this relationship. We thought we'll make the political case for a stronger economic relationship between India and the US. What I do is, from the Indian perspective, take a longer view, and a pretty long view, at least of the last 200 years in a way, India's relationship with the West. Though in a colonial period, we've seen largely India as an extension of Britain, or there was an exploitative relationship. But the fact was also, under the Raj, that India played a critical role in expanding the Enlightenment values, spreading the basic core ideas of modern democracy, values, law. And at the same time, it was also the vehicle of globalization that took place in the 19th century, where Indian capital, Indian labor moved across the Indian Ocean. And India was also the principal security provider. I mean, as we know, we're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Second World War, 2 million Indian troops, and in the First World War, 1 million Indian troops. So in a sense, there was it was not just merely a colonial relationship, it was also a partnership in which India's resources, India's capital, India's strengths played a critical role. But I think in the post-colonial period, that we deeply differed in terms of the India's national strategy, what the West was willing to do, and politically, the Cold War separated us again. And militarily, of course, increasingly, there was no security relationship. But post-1991, as India returned to a growth path, that you saw, then there was a different basis for engaging the US and the West as a whole. And what we've seen in the last 25 years is that the political relationship has advanced significantly. Today, India has a good relationship with most of the countries, but its economic relationship remains underdeveloped with Europe, with America, with Japan, let alone China. So I think the case too that we need to find different ways, that India's rise in the international system, or securing its primacy in the Indian Ocean and the subcontinent, cannot be achieved without some kind of a deeper economic partnership with the West. I mean, I think that's the case one is making. And I think that case, of course, is easy to establish, but the struggle has been in the daily politics. India's own problems of development, and America is the most advanced country. How do you find ways of integrating the two? And I think that is the political challenge. There, I think that a priori, the US way of dealing with India, look, here is X demands, please sign off on these. Or India saying, look, we can't do anything because our interests are fundamentally different, therefore we can't do anything. I think we got to move from that framework to one where we can find ways of helping each other in terms of boosting the US economy, boosting the European economy, while at the same time using that to leverage and advance India's own growth. And this is finally, it's a political art, and it's not an economic art, but finally, you got to have the political leadership on both sides, essentially finding ways in which we're going to negotiate very hard. As Amitabh pointed out, India is not going to just give away access to its market or its rights about dealing with its poor, but the different ways of doing it. So I think the key to that is really the internal reform. Much as China has reformed itself internally, in a way to take advantage of the US support and put itself in the international system as the second largest economy, that India must do both, that it needs to do internal reform, negotiate hard with the international system, with the Western-led order, and use that hardball negotiations to create space for itself. And that space is not just waiting for the next round of negotiations, but actually use it to develop yourself. So I think that is the principal challenge, whether it's IPR, whether it's climate change, whether it is trade, range of issues. Our internal change must be a key component of changing both the way we deal with the Americans and the way we improve our own position in the international system. And I think we've seen some of that in the last year and a half under the present government, the way it has dealt with the Bali trade accord, where it has dealt with dealing with the climate change issue, that this is not about surrendering position. This is not about ceding sovereignty. This is about negotiating hard, finding ways in which we find both sides can benefit. And I think that's where the real challenge is. And I think my sense is that as we look ahead, that adopting this different approach, where both the US and India approach this economic partnership from a strategic perspective, could make a difference, rather than merely letting whether in Washington, single issue groups like whether pharma or somebody else defining the trend, or in India, where the sovereignty argument is always used not to do anything. So how do we transcend that is really the challenge. And I think this lays out a broad framework in which we could advance.
Thanks, Ashley and Raj, for your comments. I'm going to actually ask both of you a question, and then we're going to open it up to the floor because we have about an hour, I think, for Q&A. Right. Ashley, I want to actually ask you first. We're talking about how the India-US relationship has got a fresh sort of push with the new government in Delhi. There was a plateauing, in a sense, before the last general election. But the same argument can be made as far as America is concerned right now, because Obama is in his last years. There's a plateauing over there, the kind of push we saw when the nuclear deal happened, for example. We're always sort of becoming victim, in a sense. The relationship is becoming victim to domestic political compulsions, domestic politics. I mean, do you see that changing ever?
It must change. The challenge that we have is that we have pushed the relationship forward, primarily through the initiatives of leaders at the very top. I don't think that is a recipe for a successful relationship over time. The initiatives of leaders are important and useful to get the relationship on a certain trajectory. But success will come when our societies and our economies essentially begin to be so open that leaders do not have to make extraordinary efforts to push the relationship in a certain direction. The argument that I have made is that if you look, for example, at the joint statements that come out of US-India summits and joint statements that come out of summits, say, between the United States and the United Kingdom, the disparity in those two joint statements, those two kinds of joint statements, is actually quite remarkable. The Indian joint statement is an extremely lengthy document running into several pages with scores of paragraphs describing initiatives that the leaders on both sides have taken. The joint statement that comes out of a US-UK conversation is usually never more than a paragraph. It appears at first sight, therefore, that the US-Indian joint statement is really a testimony of great progress. To my mind, it's exactly the opposite. The reason why you get such lengthy joint statements in the US-Indian case is because our societies and our economies are not open enough that what is extraordinary for us is actually ordinary and routine elsewhere. So we have to work to the point where essentially our two societies and our two economies become so interlinked that governments have to play the only role that is appropriate for them, which is to be spectators in watching a bilateral relationship that moves upward of its own accord. And so that is the dream, right? The day that leaders can sort of sit this thing out and watch what is a very vibrant societal and economic relationship that operates according to the laws of the market, as opposed to the intervention of leaders. I think that's the aim that we should be aspiring to.
I think that's a critical thing, actually, because as you said, if it's going to stay premised on a leader's initiative, then the bureaucrats really have no initiative of their own that they can actually take. Raj, as far as you're concerned, I mean, a part of what you've talked about is also how the sort of Pakistan-China situation and relationship plays out in the India-US equation, even though it's been dehyphenated now for a long time, as far as Pakistan is concerned as well. But do you think that the Pakistan hyphen has kind of been replaced by a China hyphen in many ways?
No, it's not. I don't think we can ever separate Pakistan from ourselves. I mean, I think the policy innovation that the Bush administration did, that look, they were not going to bind India's relationship with what they do with Pakistan. That at the height of a renewed relationship between US and Pakistan after 9/11, that you also saw the period of the maximum improvement in India-US relationship historically. So they didn't abandon their relationship with Pakistan. They were doing things with you, they're doing things with them, and trying to keep the two things separate. But it is we today constantly go back and say, look, what are you doing about Pakistan? Or why you still have a relationship with them? Or they say, look, please keep talking. But that stuff will go on. But the level of, for example, on the economic engagement has dramatically increased today. India's total trade, I think is what, 5 times larger than Pakistan's. Or so the kind of interlinkage that you have with the US today, Pakistan will take a long time to get anywhere near that. But at the same time, and I think the same works in China's favor in this case, that China has a bigger economic relationship. So and that, as we noted, the interdependence also limits the conflict between US and China. So I think it's not, for us, instead of saying, look, it's not about merely hyphenating with the Chinese, but what is it that we want? That if you want to grow, you need to do more with the leading center of the world economy, that is both US and Europe as well. So therefore, what are the terms under which we do it? And I think what China comes in is an interesting way. I think 2 levels. I think one example, the Chinese and the Americans who fought a war in 1953, the Korean War, 50 to 53, thousands of Chinese died, maybe 50, 60,000 Americans died. But 18 years later, they were allies against the Soviet Union. And Mao Zedong's own son died in the Korean War. But Mao did not bring that in to come in the way of saying, look, I want to engage, I got to now a different set of political priorities, therefore I'm going to work with the US to constrain to constrain Soviet Union. Second, I think then you saw Deng Xiaoping actually, while talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics, actually has the capacity to open up the Chinese economy for a significant, dramatic engagement with the US and the West. And with Japan, who's a former colonial occupying power. That actually, if you set your goal, look, I must grow, then how I grow is the issue. But if you say, look, my political prejudices must come in the way of stopping what I'm doing, then I think where many of our debates on that, because US has a relationship with Pakistan, we won't deal with them on other issues. It is, I think, partly that set of problems. I think the second issue for us is that, look, all these years we've been very critical, through at least the initial phases, critical of the Western-led economic order, World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods system, the WTO. We've raved and ranted against it. It's not that that thing didn't have problems, but if you look back historically, you had a relatively decent position in that system. Now the question today is, are you willing to trade that for a China-led economic institutions? See, that question we've not even begun to debate, because we've drifted into the BRICS, we've drifted into supporting the AIIB. I'm not saying, a lot of people say, look, there must be a reasonable case for it. But I'm saying, have you asked the basic question? That is, are you jumping from the frying pan into the fire? Because, if you love the Chinese-led institution, please go ahead. If Chinese hegemony is better than American hegemony, welcome. It doesn't take one phone call. Accept the Silk Road, accept Chinese money, you can prosper, surely. We're not even, no, the point is now, you're trapped in a situation where you're not fully engaging the Chinese, of willing to accept a subordinate position to the Chinese and say, you lead the world order in Asia, a Sino-centric order is good for us, we're ready to do it. Or the option is you go and the American partnership and say, look, Americans are, the Chinese think what we're doing is, you're going with a distant power to balance the near, which is what they did with the Americans and the Russians. They think we're doing the same, but we're not. Because you're so trapped in your fears of dealing with the West that you talk about it, but there's no full engagement on the economic side. Well, can we change that? I think that is the big question that's going to come, because Chinese currency is going to be more dominant around us. The Chinese weapons are going to be around us. Chinese power is radiating at us in all directions. So the question then becomes, if Chinese GDP is 5 times larger than yours, Chinese military spending is 4 times larger than yours, and Chinese relationships to neighbors are more intense than your relationships with all the other major powers and China's neighbors put together, what's your strategy? And I think this one is saying that, look, that you've got to, one, your position of rise in the international system needs a partnership, and that partnership has to be with the West. But this does not argue anywhere that we got to confront the Chinese. Right. That you take advantage of what, for example, even with the Chinese on infrastructure. Chinese want to build something in India on a competitive terms, it's fine. But the structure of the strategic relationship, strategic economic relationship will have to be essentially with the West, because the nature of your, not only your values, but the nature of your integration and the beneficial parts of it today, all your, for example, the Prime Minister, where does he go for the diaspora meetings? He goes to the US. He goes to England, and today he's going to go, Australia, Canada. I mean, this is the Anglo world. I mean, this Anglo world, Anglo-Saxon world, where actually the Indians have prospered because of your historic connection. But that connection was politically unacceptable in the first 40 years of independence. Today, that is changing. Now, can we take that to the next step, where actually our integration with the West on equal terms? I mean, saying it can only be on equal terms. It can only be on mutually beneficial terms. It can only be on terms in which India's pecking order in that system will rise. If those can be satisfied, the rest is the detail in terms of negotiation of specific issues, whether it's IPR, whether it is trade. Because China and America came to some kind of an understanding.
Right.
And China was completely outside the international system. And within 30 years, it's the second largest economy.
So before actually, I want you to address what Ashley and Rajmohan have both said. You've made some very important comments in your opening remarks. But, you know, on the one hand, when you talk about easing up processes in India, making it simpler, the bureaucratic processes, ultimately, what is stopping us from doing that? It shouldn't be a difficult thing for a government with the kind of initiative that we see to sort of boost the India-US relationship, to be able to implement those changes. Do we lack the confidence somewhere, or what is holding us back?
You know, this bit about strategic relationship is all about power. And to my mind, I've always believed that power is derived from your economic strength. And economic strength is derived from a host of internal reforms and internal dynamism. And, you know, one must clearly realize that, you know, in the last 4 weeks, China has wiped out 3.4 trillion of its economy. That's roughly about 20% of its GDP. In 1 month time, China wiped out 3.4 trillion, 20% of its GDP. That's almost about twice, almost 1.8 times India's GDP, wiped out in 1 month's time. And this is being artificially held together by a lot of boosting. And the boosting which the Chinese government has done, according to Financial Times, is almost 10 times of what America has put into its system to hold its economy together, to revive its economy, 10 times more. So I personally feel that over a long period of time, China has built up overcapacity. It's built up overcapacity across sectors, and it would require a huge amount of, you know, on the other hand, if you look at India, to my mind, India right now in 2015 is close to what America would have been in mid-70s. And India is just starting its long spurt of growth. If 350 million Indians are going to get into the process of urbanization in next 2 decades, if 700 million Indians are going to get into urbanization according to McKinsey's study, latest McKinsey study, by 2050, then India is going to urbanize, is going to industrialize, and so on. And therefore, India needs to take several radical measures, and there are several legacy issues which need to be set right. And the only way you can have strong ties with America is if you grow at those rates, because you can grow at those rates only when you open up, when you become a part of a global supply chain. And China became a part of the global supply chain. All the Apple mobiles and iPads are made in China, and therefore it became a part of global supply chain. And unless India doesn't do that, India can never integrate itself with the American economy. And to my mind, that is critical.
Okay, we have lots of hands up for questions. So I'm going to go one by one on my left and one on my right, and then we'll go down the hall this way. So could you introduce yourself and ask the question?
name is Lars-Olof Lindgren. I'm from Sweden. It's very impressive and interesting to listen to this discussion. I haven't had the opportunity to read this publication yet, but in the conclusions I saw, this is just a comment, that India, since the British Raj has harbored the aspirations to be a superpower, having superpower status. A question you can pose yourself is why so little has been done to make India live up to that aspiration. But perhaps that's a different seminar we can take on that. What I have been thinking about listening to you and seeing the conclusions is why US? Why not? Sometimes Raj says the West. And I wonder, EU, Europe, which is a bigger trading partner with India than the US, why do you pay so little attention to the European side of this? So many things you say goes just as well to motivate a closer strategic and economic relationship with Europe.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to hear. Of course, Europe is not as strong strategically, I can admit that. But still, I think it would be wrong to say we have to choose between China and US strategic relations. Why not widen the scope in that sense? And the second question is, what instruments do the government have? The ideal is not to need the government, but I think we still do to a large extent. And I agree with all the points that Amitabh has pointed out, and I agree that India needs 10 to 12% growth to be strong. And I'm so impressed every time I hear these points because Amitabh gives himself so much work to live up to all these points. But I agree fully. But what else can you do? I mean, we have a world system where you cannot discriminate. You cannot give off the board better conditions to one country unless you have a free trade agreement. And that could be one instrument. But I can see India and US are very far away from a free trade agreement. I think Europe and India was closer until yesterday or the day before when this was put on the back burner. And I am so disappointed because 8 years has gone with an agreement that is so obviously beneficial to both partners, and we have not been able to put it in practice.
So I'm going to actually just ask you to let both Rajamohan and Mr. Kant answer your two questions. Rajamohan on why America and why not Europe, and Mr. Kant, you can take the question he addressed to you directly.
I think if you read the Discovery of India, I mean, Nehru talks about the future world of 6 major powers: US, Russia, China, Japan, and Europe, a united Europe, and then India. I mean, you can ask, I mean, why did India fall back? I mean, I think one way of thinking about it is the kind of economic strategy that it had to adopt at a given point of time. While it had many benefits internally, but it also saw an inward-oriented economy resulted in India's relative decline in the international system. I mean, I think a lot of people don't like it, but the fact is your relative indicators on trade, total size of your economy relative to your population, they've all relative decline because of East Asia did so well and a lot of others did so well. So, but I think that was reversed in 1991. That I think as India's outward orientation began, that you see India is now already the eighth largest economy in nominal terms. It's the 3rd largest in PPP terms. And it is the 3rd largest military force it's always been. It is the 7th largest defense spender. So I think the high growth rates which Amitabh talked about, moment you went on high growth path, the direction shifted in India. Completely where today the potential that we talk about India is essentially because of the high growth rates that have taken place. The question is now, can you sustain it for a longer period of time on a higher path that Amitabh. On Europe, I think I have no disagreement. Actually, I would say, because US is, like we say US for international community. I mean, most of the time, I mean, it's easier. So I think Europe, is important and I think remains one of the biggest economies. Individually, of course, we have good relationship, but Europe as a collective has not figured strategically. But I think if you get one right, I mean, you automatically get the others right in the West.
Okay, Mr. Kant said he's going to take a couple of questions. We'll all take a couple of questions, and then he's going to address the one.
Don't grill me, grill them.
He'll grill you as well, but I think he had a question specifically for you. But we'll open up the floor to questions. We'll take 3 questions at a time. 1, 2, and 3, and then I'll come to Mr. Qureshi and KP Nair. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
They know me, but I'm General Chopra. I'm a happy platinum veteran. Okay, mine is shorter. I want to ask the authors on the strategic plane. You have both concluded that India aspired to regional hegemony. And if we develop stronger economic linkages with the US, it will advance our quest for regional hegemony. On the other hand, the entire world, including the US, blames China in Asia, South China Sea, etc., for being a hegemonist. And here you're advocating hegemony for India.
Okay.
While I'm all for greater power status, I don't agree with you on great power, nor do I agree on superpower, but I'm all for greater power status. The strength of India for balancing, which Ashley you talked about in the Indo-Pacific, can only come about through growth militarily and economically, for which we need assistance from the US. So I want you to just explain this business of hegemony. I'm not with this concept. And a very short question, Raja, on trust, since you asked him about Pakistan. Do we have enough trust with the US in view of their dual policy with Pakistan? I know we will economically go ahead, but on the strategic plane, I don't think that trust is there because America keeps doing to Pakistan covertly what China is doing overtly. Thank you.
All right. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Suresh Goel, retired ambassador. Amitabh and Ashley, I mean, today I heard I think the mantras for the most successful marriage. Economic ambitions, strategic objectives, etc., etc. Wonderful, really. And I think I agree with you completely that we need to have the strength and we should be able to change what we have at the moment if we want to succeed in the world. And yes, I think it's important to really take into account the need for the marriage with the USA. My thought is a bit different, really, in the sense of what should be the fulcrum of this marriage, really. To condense what Nandan said, the summary, to further condense it to one sentence, what your thesis is, that the economic engagement between India and the US must be enhanced to enable the USA to become stronger globally so that it can play a stronger strategic role globally. And that is very strongly reminiscent of the debate that we had in the early 90s internationally, where an attempt was made to link up development with the security. Nothing wrong with it. But what was thought was that therefore development should become a subject of Security Council consideration because it is linked to security. The problem with that argument was, and that is where I'm coming to really the change of the fulcrum, if there is a strategic dissonance, the whole theory collapses. Similarly, if we are going to link up with the hegemony of China or the hegemony of so on and so forth, if the China factor collapses or changes, again the whole theory of the marriage between India and USA collapses. So my suggestion is that rather than using the strategic or the security factors as the fulcrum to advocate this marriage between India and the USA, a marriage should have its own argument, should have its own strength, really. And therefore, the fact that India by itself has a role to play in the region, and that role itself must be a strong rationale for the USA to come in the alliance with India. Similarly, the factors such as terrorism, extremism, stability, the political stability of the region are factors strong enough which do not link or hyphenate with any other factor which can collapse. That's my comment, and maybe a reaction from you.
Okay. I just want to ask Ashley and Rajamohan, do you want to take a couple more questions and club them together? All right, okay, fine. Yes, go ahead, sir.
My name is Vinod Sehgal. The strategic rationale for deeper US-Indian economic ties, Ashley, I mean, you built in your own contradiction. At what stage does the strategic rationale undergo modification? I'm telling you why. Take out the term strategic, it's all right. Because if India becomes economically strong and naturally other attributes of power flow from that, India, because it is located where it is, as opposed to where US is located, will have to balance out. This can only go up to a certain point. After 10 years, the rationale for the strategic, because how deep is deeper, must undergo modification. I won't elaborate, I think you're getting the point.
Professor Muni, you had a question as well?
Rather simple questions. One is, this strategic rationale is absolutely understandable. It was way back in 2000 that US discovered that India is a strategic partner. Why it is that it has taken 15 long years to come to this conclusion that economic support is essential, and even after coming to that conclusion, why it is that there are so big question marks on technology and investments even now, despite all that it has happened. Secondly, I understand Amitabh's uneasiness on why India is not being able to deliver. But look, India is not being able to deliver. Look,
I don't have any uneasiness.
no.
I was never
Or your
uneasy.
impatience that why we are not growing, or why we cannot change these laws. Well, your land bill is one answer. And the problem has not come because of the opposition. The problem comes because of the BJP internal pressures. You have to look at the society, social structure, your labor conditions, your political system. The way China delivered, taking capital and technology from the US, I don't know if India today, even now, having said all that, is in a position to deliver in the sense they deliver, because of various other constraints inbuilt into the situation. Now, if that is not, that cannot take place, how really you push this matrimony further?
Okay, I think we'll just answer these and then move forward. Otherwise, there'll be just way too many questions. Chopra's questions on hegemony. I want both Ashley and Rajamohan to take this. Yeah.
Hegemony is not as bad a word as it sounds. It was said about Wagner's music. It's actually, look, I mean, in academic terms, I think hegemony is used, it replaced, in shall we say, as in equal terms as primacy, that look, there is a reality of someone's primacy in a system. So of course, it can be used in a pejorative terms, it can be used as condemnatory. It's Chinese, for example, when India conducted its nuclear tests, this is an expression of Indian hegemony in the subcontinent. Now, that is, so it's a language, I think you could have said, look, you could have easily replaced it with primacy if it had less offensive. But I think the fact is, I think one of the things of the report, you're being brutally frank in a way, that why should the US help India? I think you're saying because they want to retain their primary position in the international system. The twin part of it is, look, why should India partner the United States? Because it's going to help India's expansion of India's capabilities. And that's why we're talking about Indian hegemony in India. Hegemony, of course, we always wanted it. Our problem in the subcontinent is not the lack of desire, but the fact that your inability to enforce it. Because of a relative economic decline, that China is a bigger trading partner to your neighbors today than you are. The China supplies military weapons to all your neighbors. You are not even exporting any arms. So I think certain historic circumstances have taken place. So the question is, look, it is about a shared interest. Like it is in great power politics. This is not a Sant Samaj, This is not all saint society. They're not gathering here to, to Jan Kalyan or whatever you want. These days Hindi has to be used, to do universal welfare. But they're doing to reinforce each other's strategic aims. And within that, you give and take. That is the question. So it is only about the structural thing and not the terms that we use. We want to say nice things, India is a democracy, values. We say some of that also. But yeah. So the second part is, look, Pakistan distrust. The question is, look, are you willing to make Pakistan the touchstone of every single international relationship that you have? Americans, the Chinese, the Saudis, the Gulf, everybody in the world has a relationship with Pakistan. Even the Russians are going to have one. So are you going to make it that if you have a relation, that's never been our policy. You never said, I won't deal with you if you have a relationship with Pakistan. All we're saying is, look, don't do the kind of things we don't like. So we complain to the Americans, don't give arms. But there is also a difference between what Americans have done with Pakistan and what China has done with Pakistan. Americans have not given nuclear weapons to Pakistan. It is the Chinese who gave them nuclear weapons. Americans' fault was to wink at it or to keep quiet about it. But the fact is, finally, the sanctions were imposed by the United States against China and Pakistan. So I think, in our obsession with what is essentially an internal civil war within the subcontinent, you transpose it to one of what outsiders should do to you. I'm saying, as you grow stronger, and as Amitabh was saying, look, if you grow stronger, today your economy is 7 times bigger than Pakistan. Your capacity to deal with the rest of the actors significantly improves. The question is, do we get there without getting trapped in a tutu mamak, shall we say, within the subcontinent, which on a daily basis, I'm not blaming the television for it, but there we are on a daily basis. But on the other issue which was raised, I mean, marriage has to be on its own merits. I mean, it's not. No, but there is also an occasion. Look, like China and US under Deng Xiaoping did not get together, or Mao Zedong did not reach out to, to Mr. Nixon just because it is a good idea. But there is life, like as a diplomat, life moves in a particular context, and things are undertaken in a specific context. So that's what I mean. But if you build a good relationship, that's the example of US and China. Having built a strong interdependence, today it's become very difficult to get a divorce, as I said. So you build a relationship that has a value of its own, irrespective of how you do it or why you do it.
Rather, sorry, I was only saying that let the marriage be for the love between the India and the USA, and not because of a third person. That's all I was saying. Thank you.
Sure.
Marriage is usually for a third person.
Ashley, I'm going to ask you actually to also address this issue of hegemony, since it was directed at you, and also what Professor Muni said actually about, why has it taken so long for America to actually sit up and say, okay, fine, India is this important partner and we need to engage with it differently?
We thought of this publication is that it's meant to be an exercise in brutal truth-telling, right? We can always talk about the flowery dimensions of the relationship. And, our political leaders do a very good job of that. So we figured it's no point duplicating what has already been done. At the end of the day, there is a theme that runs through both our papers, which is the fundamental primacy of national interests in the decisions that we make. We love India for all sorts of reasons. But at the end of the day, the most important reason why India matters to the United States today is because it impacts a core American national security objective. And that core national security objective is to protect American primacy in the international system. Now, we never talk about these things in this direct and transparent a fashion, and appropriately so. So I would not want the President of the United States to say what I'm saying, but I have the luxury of not being the President of the United States. And therefore, I can articulate things that others know full well, but for various reasons will not say it. So I will not deny for a moment that there should be reasons that go beyond third parties. I won't deny that. But the truth of the matter is, if those reasons don't impact my core interests, I'm not going to pursue a relationship based on those peripheral reasons. So it's not that India is not important in itself, but from an American national perspective, for it to capture American attention, it must meet the test of relevance to my strategic objectives. And that's really the answer to Professor Muni's question. The reason the United States did not discover India until 15 years ago is because until 15 years ago, India was irrelevant to the core national security challenges faced by the United States. It's only after the Cold War ends. Yeah.
Why you did not discover earlier? I'm saying you discovered us in 2000. It has taken 15 years for capital and technology really to start flowing to India.
But this is
It is still a lot of hurdles.
fair enough. But this is a process. Because I think it takes time to change a tradition which has become embedded in the US system. The US system of controls, the US system of regulation goes back now almost 60 years to the height of the Cold War. These institutions cannot be changed overnight. The important test for me is, are the trend lines in the right direction? If the trend lines are in the direction of greater liberality, then I think that is, the war is half won. Let me answer the question about hegemony just to make the point. See, hegemony for me is essentially leadership. I mean, that's the original Greek origins of the word, right? And for the United States, however it is disguised, the principal objective of the United States is to protect its power position. Now, we can talk about it in more benign ways, we can talk about it in less benign ways. So when we talk about hegemony, whether it applies to India in the regional context or the US globally, it's not meant to be a normative statement of any sort. It simply refers to a particular positioning on the power scale. And that simply derives, from what I think of as material facts of life. India is destined, whether it wants it or not, to be hegemonic in its region because of the power imbalances that favor India. The real question for India is whether it can actually actualize what is potential power into the kind of power that Amitabh was talking about, which is the ability to secure outcomes based on that actualized power. For the United States, it's the same story. There is an inequality of power in the international system that favors the United States. For us, the challenge is how do we preserve that inequality in our favor?
Candid, how do you preserve the inequality in your favor? But actually, if I can just also interject, you've just talked about how regulations in the United States go back to 60 years. One of the things that Mr. Kant was talking about is the sort of prohibitive nature of the regulations that India also has. So isn't that a bit of a, yeah, it's the same thing in a sense, yes.
There's a difference. And I mean that in a different sort of way. There's a difference because the regulations that were built in the United States were regulations intended to prevent others from getting access to critical technologies. The regulations that Mr. Kant is complaining about, and which I complain about, are the self-imposed regulations that Indians have essentially enacted for themselves and which have become burdens on India's capacity to actualize its own power. The status of this kind of regulatory deficiency is very different from the kind of regulations in the US. For us, our regulations are intended to prevent people from getting access to what we think are critical technologies. Now, we are certainly shifting those in a direction that I think is positive. But for India, the larger challenge is a very simple one. Why should India continue to shackle itself when the alternative to that shackling is something far more important for India's own success within and success on the outside?
Yeah, Mr. Qureshi, yes, go ahead, sir. Yes, your question.
I'm a student of democracy in South Asia. A question for Mr. Kant and for the panelists. Mr. Kant, you were only focusing on economic relations, and India should become an economic giant. Then only India, US will look at us. But I think US has no choice because for geopolitical reason also, if not India, who else? So I think that was the point which was getting missed. And secondly, 10 years ago, I was the Additional Secretary and Financial Advisor in Ministry of Steel. I have no experience of economic ministries, I must confess. I'd gone to South Korea to negotiate iron ore prices in POSCO. And out of my innocence and stupidity, I said, why don't you come and invest in India? I said, invest in what? I said, you make in India, make steel in India, and invest in our railroad and the dockyard. To my horror, they immediately agreed, and I panicked. I said, what was the catch? So I asked my neighbor, did I make a mistake, or was it a faux pas? Why have they agreed suddenly? Within a month, I arranged their coming to India arranged meeting. They decided for the biggest foreign investment of $12 billion. Last week, I read a news item that finally they've given up and decided to pack up and go. Even if you write off 9 years of UPA, but 1 year into Make in India, this to happen. So while you're concerned that we have to make it business friendly, now this is a test case for you. Here was somebody who wanted to make in India, has been around for 10 years. Why are you letting them go? Make it a case study and don't let this happen. Secondly, the first part, which is about strategy, that was my focus. I'm at the moment actually studying South Asian democracy, and I mentioned it deliberately because maybe there are some other experts around this table who can advise and guide me on this. Whether it's strengthening democracy in these 16 countries, because 60% of the world's democracy lives in the 16 countries. Now, and they're all around China. Whether strengthening democracy is in our strategic interest. Although 2 weeks ago I was in Chatham House and talking to a defense expert, he said democracy is irrelevant for the defense establishment. We don't care whether you're democratic or not, because we have some other consideration. But now I would like to have an answer whether that was the right response, whether the strengthening democracy is important. If it is, then what could be US-India interest to work jointly to strengthen democracies? Because India is the senior most democracy, can play a lot of role. We can do hand-holding, we can train them, teach them, guide them. We have an Infrastructure and Election Commission and IADM, International Institute. 52 countries have trained from us. Well, a little bit of guidance on that will be appreciated.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. KP, I know you had, Manoj, you had a question.
You avoided my question, actually.
I think, okay, did we not address Mr. Sehgal's
No,
question?
because when I said how deep is deep, it's loaded. No political dispensation in India can go beyond a certain point. We are nation power also. So just answer that question, because I said how deep is deep.
Okay, Ashley, I'll let.
We'll take it in there.
We'll take it in the next round. Yeah, KP, go ahead.
KP Nair, I'm with the Telegraph newspaper. There have been a slew of reports in the last months and weeks about the outflow of money from India. I don't mean investment money, but money, savings money from foreign currency non-resident accounts and non-resident external accounts, which constitute actually the core of India's impressive foreign exchange reserves. I've had friends from the US East Coast and West Coast tell me that over the next 1 or 2 years, they intend to liquidate large amounts, that is millions, of their savings in FCNR and NRE accounts as the fixed deposits mature. And they attribute this decision to the Indian government's decision to sign the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, which they say exposes them to IRS in a way they were exposed never before. So my question to the panel is, isn't an American insistence on streamlining, institutionalizing, legalizing the economic relationship creating more problems than having a positive effect? And it's actually not confined just to economic matters. You know, the rethink on the foundational agreements on defense cooperation by this government, for example, is another instance. I mean, if you insist on legislation in this country, what you get is something like the Nuclear Liability Act. You know, so my question is, isn't it better to let
Things be.
the other way of the more informal way of developing the economic relationship continue rather than insist on streamlining?
Okay, I'm just going to request everyone to keep their questions brief. That way we can take more questions. We have about 23 minutes left. Manoj, you had a question, and then I see 2 hands up in the back and here. I'll go to all of you. Yeah, I did see him. Yeah.
You know, the point I'd like to make is, Ashley spoke of core national interests of the United States. I'm one of those who believes that at this juncture, it is a core national interest of the United States to have close political ties with the United States, of India to have close political ties with the United States for one very simple reason. That is the rising power of China. in the sense that the rise of China has been so swift, and the imbalance, the military balance is so tilted against us that if we do not look out for friends and allies, and which means, of course, the United States and Japan and other countries. So, as far as I'm concerned, I come from that kind of a position. But then looking at the subject on hand, what I find, close economic partnership does not necessarily create a close political partnership. That's obvious. Likewise, close political partnership, as Raj pointed out, that between Egypt, Pakistan, United States, does not necessarily create a close economic partnership. This is something which you construct. And I think what we are talking about, the issues of construction, and I find that there are a lot of gaps there. But when it comes to India and the United States, surely you will agree, Ashley, that as far as the economic part of the relationship is concerned, that's more left to, because we are both market economies, that's more left to the respective private sectors themselves. By and large, the private economic sectors. The government certainly has certain, because when it comes to rules and regulations, it has a role. But it has to be US companies must be interested in India, and Indian companies must be interested in US. There's nothing the government can do. All they can do is to improve the regulatory part of it. But the key issue is close political relations. Close political relationships are something which two governments can construct and should construct. But here we come to a perpetual problem. And that, I think, General Chopra mentioned this indirectly in the question of Pakistan mistrust. I won't say Pakistan as such. I would say geopolitical issues. Now, whether you look at the currently evolving situation with regard to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, the differences that are appearing between India and the United States there, or whether you look at the constant worry we have about China-US relationships. Often we overstate the China-US rivalry. Yes, there are problems. South China Sea, there are problems. But there's always that G2 thing which is hanging somewhere at the back of our heads. Or whether you look at Japan and China, or Vietnam and China, all of them have their bilateral ties with China, and many of them can suddenly change. I mean, Vietnam, China, for example, has the capacity to change very quickly. Japan, China has the capacity to change very quickly. And then I wonder whether we get left hanging high and dry.
Give me a second.
Okay, Rajamohan, you want to go first? And then we'll take another round of 3, and I think we'll have to end it at that. So,
no,
go ahead.
I think on the democracy issue, which Mr. Qureshi raised, I think it's been one of the themes in the last 15 years, whether India and US should do more. Of course, it's not as easy as we say it. Of course, for example, in the case of Pakistan, where US kind of pulls back on the democracy argument, and India too, finds it difficult to make that a central piece of engagement with Pakistan. But in some cases, things have changed. For example, in Burma, where it used to be an argument between India and in the US. Today, as Burma is moving towards democracy, of course, you have actually a much better position. But I think as a general principle, India and the US working together to make it, all the things you said. I think training people or promoting values. That, of course, there will always be difference in terms of at least sections of the US talking about a crusade to force democracy on other societies, while India is more of working with others, in a less imposing kind of way. But my sense is the US itself has moved away from that kind of an imposition of the type that was talked about 2 decades ago to one of more encouragement rather than imposition. So I think it's something, given the core values of the two societies, that issue will always be there. But it can't be applied consistently in all cases. But the more we do together on that, I think it'll also be a good binding force. But it is the second order issues that derive from it on question of rights, different sets of rights, whether it's sexual rights, minority rights, how it gets enforced in the US, how it gets enforced in India. So there can be differences, but I think in a sense what you said, that you have a shared set of values, working together on that, even in a minimal, limited way, has a value of its own.
Okay. Ashley?
I just wanted to set the record right on POSCO. Maybe moving out of Orissa, but it's getting into Maharashtra and Goa.
If I understand Vinod's question, you're asking me whether there is a limit beyond which India cannot go, and therefore that might constrain its ability to build a relationship of the kind that we are looking for, right? I think that misconceives the problem because the United States is not interested in a relationship with India because of what India can do for the United States. The United States is interested in a relationship with India where India becomes something, not because India does something. We see our interests served by an India that is capable and powerful in its own right. Even if India does not ever do anything for the United States, it is still in American interest to want a capable, stable, and powerful India in its region. And that goes to the question that you asked. We have no interest in an India that does things militarily vis-a-vis China. All that we want is that India becomes powerful enough that the Chinese cannot afford to overlook India as a factor in their own geopolitical calculations when China deals with us. So, in a sense, India's growth in power provides a reason that forces China to distract itself from its obsession with the United States. And that's the essence of the strategy. So if India becomes capable and causes China to always keep India in its peripheral vision, our objectives are served. So the question of compelling India to do something is really not on the American agenda, at least in the way that I think about it. Second, the issue of formalism in US-Indian ties. Shouldn't we simply learn to live and kind of live well alone, right? The problem that we have is that we are not simply abstract billiard balls dealing with each other. We are also societies which have our own traditions, and in the case of the United States and in India, very complex legal systems. The reason why at some stage these formal agreements become necessary is for two reasons. The trivial reason is that sometimes US law simply requires them. And because we believe we are a nation of laws and not simply a nation of men, not even the President of the United States sometimes has the authority to waive away what are essentially standing laws. I'll give you a simple example. It is the law of the United States that when military equipment is sold to any country, the US government has an obligation to make certain that it monitors what is called the end use of that military equipment. Now, because this is the law of the land, the President of the United States simply cannot say, in this case, I'm going to waive away that obligation. Now, it is an encumbrance, there's no question. It's not only India that complains, our closest allies complain because the law applies equally to them as it does to India. So now, you can't say, we want to have a relationship with the United States, but we don't like this particular aspect of the relationship. Therefore, let's find new terms for engagement. It's not going to happen. If you enter into a relationship with the United States, you enter into a relationship with your eyes wide open. You factor into your calculations that these are going to be the complications that you have to manage. And you do the net assessment of whether it is worth it in your interests entering into that relationship given all these encumbrances. Now, most countries in the world, and they may be crazy, but it turns out to be a fact, that most countries in the world say, despite all these encumbrances, it is worth having this relationship with the United States because there's something in it for us. I hope that India reaches that same conclusion. The last point is I disagree with Manoj on this issue. I wish the United States and India could relate to each other purely through markets. The fact of the matter is that there are substantial obstacles, especially in India, to dealing with the United States at purely market levels. A very simple test is to look at relative tariff rates in the two countries, to look at the character of non-tariff barriers in the two countries. So I think we want to aim for the objective of actually allowing both countries to deal purely with markets so that governments can go on to do other things. But as things stand, I think we are not there yet. And so part of what I hope, the relationship will do, and in fact, at least my chapter in the report spends quite a bit of time talking about the economics of the relationship, is to move towards an elimination of those structural constraints that are preventing economic ties from developing. And my fear is that if we do not move to eliminate those structural ties, you will have a relationship that is very high on aspirations, that requires enormous amounts of political energy to sustain it, and not enough ballast to keep it operating outside of political direction. And so if we can move to eliminate the barriers that deepen the economic interests, then to that degree, the burdens that are placed on the political management of the relationship become smaller. I'll just take one more second to address the question of the EU. I've actually taken the heretical position in my paper that while the United States and India should aim towards a deeper economic relationship, eventually ending up in a free trade agreement, I'm very cognizant of the fact that the welfare gains to both India and the United States from a free trade agreement are actually less than the welfare gains to India emerging from an India-EU and an India-ASEAN free trade agreement. And so in the paper, what I argue is that India should focus on the EU and ASEAN first, just as the United States should focus on TPP and TTIP first. But then the question becomes, assuming that we actually succeed in our objectives, and India gets the two agreements of interest to itself, which is the EU and ASEAN, and the US takes care of TTIP and TPP, what next? And my argument is that once you reach that point, you really need to think of a US-India FTA, because you will end up otherwise in the very awkward situation where two strategic partners end up discriminating only against each other. And that is really the purpose for talking about a US-India FTA now, even though I know that a US-India FTA in the queue will probably be last in line.
All right. Master, yes.
The end of session. I was quite, if I take the logic of the strategic rationale correctly, and we assume that it is a given, then there has to be greater cooperation between the US and India in norm setting and rule setting in the Indo-Pacific region. Raja alluded to it when he talked about the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank. On the other hand, you have the TPP. If there is a deeper political rationale to the relationship, the strategic rationale, what is the carve-outs that the US would be ready to give India? Because obviously we will not meet eye to eye on everything.
Yep.
And there are certain strategic areas for India which it will not give into. So is US ready to give carve-outs? And we will have to deal with that when we come to the India-US FTA, because there has to be special dispensation for India because we are at different levels of development. And this is a point that we have to deal with. Secondly, early 90s, India was far more difficult place to do business. GE made a strategic decision to come in because the US administration decided to push American companies to come to India for various reasons. It was a political decision of the US government to push American companies to come here. And that can be done in India, it can be done in US. Is the American administration ready to do that?
Dhirendra Jha, I'm a trade lawyer. My question was going to be on any prospective FTA, because I actually believe that the welfare gains to India would potentially be very high. if you could have an FTA, as I was going to suggest. And this is where I think your title, if Americans understood that, and they took a decision to take a generous view to India the way they did to their allies in Europe and the Far East in the early decades of the Cold War, and which you haven't seen thereafter, on policies and so on and so forth. That would be something because the US market is the world's leading market for most countries. You'd be surprised that, for instance, Koreans find that they can't export the India-made Korean cars back to Korea because of quality perceptions. But the minute that Indian software engineers did well in the US in the late 90s, there were queries coming in from everywhere. So you see, before that, 30 years before that, Honda never made cars in Japan, successfully built and sold cars in the US, and the whole world wanted Honda cars. So it is the market to succeed in, it's the market to be in, and if you're there, it solves half of your international marketing problems for your companies everywhere else in the world, and quality perceptions. So an FTA built on a premise that yes, the US cannot abandon the high standards and various things it's looking for, but nor is India going to sign it today. But instead of saying India sign it first and make all these reforms first and go through all these hoops, and then you may or may not get benefits, have an FTA which is before the high standards thing, ambitious in a traditional sense of tariff reduction and so on,
Right.
on both sides, but then has concrete targets, like India should have a market share of in US manufactured goods imports of over 10% per year for 3 years.
Sorry,
in a
I
row.
don't mean to cut you off. We've got just 3 minutes left. So I'm
Before
gonna,
we would have
ask
to
you to keep it
have a
brief.
working group to attend to high standards issues.
Okay. All right. Last question from the gentleman there. Could you just pass the mic across the aisle?
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Ashley Tellis. I'm Majoril Chakravarti. Well, Ashley, I have been dealing with the United States at the strategic level. We've got radars from them, the ultralight howitzer. I've been actually involved. I want to say very, very frankly, while everything is leader-driven, it's extremely difficult to deal with the working level in the United States. You can't get a tire. For getting a tire, I have spoken, I've had video conferences, and it starts from Hawaii. The entire map of the United States I have learned by heart, despite visiting. I can assure you none of you know. Believe me, you got the gentleman from Sweden. I am trained over there. Much easier. France, much easier. I've been there. And I can tell you that it's not so easy. It's nice to have this word strategic rational. I'll just give you the second question which I have. You have India and China coming under the SINPAC. The entire strategic relationship which you started with Condi Rice and George Bush, in which you are actively involved, all right, was based on one appreciation from the SINPAC that India does what you said. Now, I want to ask you, Pakistan comes under the Central Command. I have met both these commands in the US and in India. Both have entirely different ways of thinking. They are two separate planets in this world. One is in Tampa and the other is in Hawaii. The reach, they have separate timings, they have separate thoughts, they have separate looks. I've been to both these places. How are you going to bridge these gaps? I'm talking at the actual, nice to have these lovely agreements. I have been trained at Karlskoga in Sweden. And even now we are getting things done. How are you going to, very nice in this air-conditioned room to get these gaps bridged. How are you going to bridge the gap between, firstly, Hawaii and Tampa? All right? The next gap is, how are you getting the working level working with? We have had video conferences in the US Embassy for hours, and nobody has been able to take us anywhere. I haven't been able to get tires, I haven't been able to get spares. Please help us.
We got the question. Not easy. Ashley and Rajendra. Ashley, I think the questions
I share the frustration about having to deal with US officialdom. When I was in the US government, the biggest challenge I faced was not with my opposite numbers in New Delhi, but within people in my own government. And I made more enemies in Washington than I made in Delhi, even though I was supposed to be representing US interests here. So there is no easy answer to that question. And I don't want to give you an extended answer because it goes into the complications of how the US manages its defense system, the fact that each of the combatant commanders essentially functions as lawyers for the countries in their area of responsibility, and so on and so forth. But the point is well taken. This is going to be a work in progress that, it's not going to be solved anytime soon. I want to address the FTA question because that's really, to me, the core issue. I do not think a US-India FTA today is possible. And I don't think it is possible precisely for the reasons that you pointed out, that there are huge disparities in levels of development, and trade has not yet reached a critical mass. But I want to think of a US-India FTA as an ambition. And I want to think of it as an ambition because India's calculations with respect to an FTA will change as India itself develops. So if you're talking of an FTA at India's current level of development, I don't think there will be an appetite for it at all, least of all in the US Trade Representative's office, because they don't want to be cracking their skulls on something that is purely chimerical. But we have to think of life, over a 15 to 20 year period, because FTAs will not be negotiated in 1-2 years. And so in the book, what I do is I talk of a phased approach to an FTA. And the objective, the way to get there must be to start liberalizing trade even in the absence of an FTA discussion. And this is something that we both have to do. And when that FTA happens, I don't know if it will eventually have carve-outs, but it will definitely have to be sequenced. That is, you will have to keep those sectors where you have acute vulnerabilities last in the liberalization process. And we have sectors where we have vulnerabilities. India has sectors where it has its own vulnerabilities. And so the question is, how do you synchronize the vulnerabilities that both sides have as they move towards an FTA? Which means that by definition, it will be sequential. It will not be an FTA that suddenly comes into action. On the point that you made, should we aim for an FTA that at least looks at traditional tariff reduction while looking at the standards over time? It's an interesting argument. The problem that I fear is a political one. I don't see the United States as having an appetite for doing that. And the reason for that is because the political class in the United States has become fearful of what other FTAs have done, particularly to middle class and middle income Americans. And so to sell an FTA politically requires that at least some benefits to the United States get front-loaded. You cannot sell an FTA politically in the United States if you tell them, oh, there will be benefits for the United States, but they come only 30 years out. In the interim, all the benefits go to India. If that is the structure of your FTA, believe me, the Congress, it will die on arrival in the Congress. So the question then becomes, are there mutual carve-outs that can be constructed that allow the United States at least some taste of what benefits this FTA process brings? And then you get into the very complicated world of give and take. Because if you take the position that we are not going to give because we are a poor country and we are a developing country, then let's forget the FTA idea altogether, because the United States is simply not going to settle for that kind of a bargain. So this is the challenge that both countries face. But my view is, look, before we even get to an FTA, let us do things that we can do with respect to unilateral liberalization. There are so many things that India can do in terms of getting gains from trade that do not require reciprocity. In fact, India comes out ahead through unilateral liberalization in so many sectors that have absolutely nothing to do with respect to reciprocity from its trading partners. And you don't do this because you think that you're giving something away. You do this because there are gains to yourself. Now that requires political will. And, I would feel a lot better if Mr. Kant was a politician as opposed to being a bureaucrat, because then he could actually put, his money where his mouth is, because his intentions are noble. But it is one thing for someone like him to say India should do this. It's another thing for the political class to actually go out and do it. And all the debates we've had about land reforms and stuff, have proved that point.
Just as an end conclusion, I think a few thoughts. I mean, one, I think the Professor Muni has gone. I mean, I think the U.S. position has also changed. I mean, I think partly where the U.S. was, say, whether it was in 1945 or in 1991, where it was on top. I mean, in terms of its position, unchallenged in 45 and economically, but then you had the Cold War, but in 1991 again as the number one power. But I think today, so the whole age of the globalization post 1991. Today, there are second thoughts on globalization within the West, including in the US. You saw the difficulty the president had in his own party, which refused to give him the rights to do the FTA, the TPP, and you had to do a lot of maneuver to get them back in position. So in a sense, the US, which was the most open economy, today has a bigger political problem that you can't do the way you did it in the past, merely by saying, look, we need it for political reasons. So there has to be an economic component in itself. And second, India's position has changed. That India, from being, as I said, as a developing country, it still is a developing country, but the structure of its economy has fundamentally changed. I mean, in a $2 trillion economy, your total trade, including goods and services, is close to $1 trillion. So you're talking about an international exposure to the Indian economy today, which is fundamentally different from where it was 25 years ago. So today you can't, the political class still behaves, of course, it is still about 1986, 1987, Dunkel draft, we'll stand up against the WTO. That approach, today you don't have the North Korea option. You don't have even Burma option has gone. I mean, that you can't do what you did before, stand up and say no to you, I don't give a damn, or I can't do it because my politics does not allow it. Because your economy today demands a set of engagement with the international system, not just with the US. Of having to rearrange your domestic economy to meet the global standards. And as a large economy, of course, you have relatively more political capacity to bargain and to achieve the transition. The question, I think, we've not used that capacity. We've just stood up, posturing, defining, and pulling back, and that not using, while China, in fact, was not present in the global trading system, had to beg everybody to get into the WTO. And through a period of expanding economic engagement, today they've changed their position to one of dominating the discourse from being one of actually seeking entry into a club they were not present. But our thing, though we were members of the club from the beginning, our thing has been, we don't like it, we can't do it. So the problem is still with the political class. I mean, that how do you adapt to the new circumstance? And how can you make the transition in every sector? Like on climate change, I mean, India and China, similar problem 20 years ago. But today China is selling solar technology, India is not. That we could have gone down the same path, but China today is in a position where it has leverage its market, leverage the external investments, stealing some technology from Europeans who have been very nice to them, and to be able to use that to reverse their position in the international system. But we have, but a priori, using political arguments to stay away from globalization has actually made opposition that much more difficult and demanding. But the question is still, you have no option of going back.
Right. I think at that we're going to have to conclude no option of going back, and an FTA that we should be progressive about rather than keep it in traditional frameworks. That is one of the suggestions. The India-US relationship, as I said earlier before the session began, would probably benefit from the export of people like Jon Stewart and John